Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, and the Jews retaining the territory which they had control of before 1967. That's essentially a two-state solution, which is the only fair and just solution to the conflict. And it's possible if Obama publishes his own parameters, my assumption is that they will be more or less in line with what President Clinton proposed back in 2000.
Okay, but Norman, I mean, considering the settlement situation in the West Bank, I mean, is that realistic at all? Is any Israeli government going to say to 500,000 settlers, pack up and leave? Is that going to? It's politically not going to happen.
I don't know. We can't say with any certainty what politically will happen, because, as you know from other historical examples, say in the case of Algeria, at the end of the Algerian War, 1 million pieds noirs, Algerians who lived in, French who lived in Algeria and who lived there for a full century, about 1 million pieds noirs, 1 out of every 9 Algerians went back to their homeland. So you can't say with any certainty that some settlement prospect is impossible. What I would like, however, to look at is the record on this issue. I agree with Dr. Morris that probably the only feasible settlement and the politically supported settlement is one that calls for 2 states with a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, and a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. Those are the terms for resolving the conflict. Those terms have been endorsed by the entire international community. And you can see it by looking at the United Nations General Assembly each year.
All right, Dr. Morris, go ahead, Benny. Benny, go ahead, before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Can I interject? Again, Dr. Finkelstein is twisting things. The international community does not support a settlement of the refugee problem based on the right of return. In fact, the international community, except for some banana republics in Africa and Arab and Muslim countries, do not support the right of return of refugees. This is something clearly ruled out by the Clinton parameters, by the West in general, since 1949. A settlement of the refugee...
If I might look...
All right, gentlemen, if I could jump in here after a short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Stay with RT.
My name is Marina Ella. I'm 14. I'm 15. I don't go to school. My name is Asia Kuyumba. When I was raped, I was 12.
Every month, we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing whether the proximity talks between Israel and the Palestinians will ever lead to peace. But before, let's see who Russians support in this conflict.
A new round of talks between Israelis and Palestinians is underway. The Palestinians have agreed to so-called proximity talks, set up with a 4-month deadline to produce results. U.S. Middle East envoy George Mitchell is holding indirect negotiations in a bid to start the direct peace process between Palestinians and Israelis. Many see it as the first significant step forward in the Obama administration's attempts to break the deadlock in Israeli-Palestinian relations since talks stopped in December 2008. Among Russians, there is no strong preference supporting a particular side in this conflict. According to a Levada Center study, 12% of Russians feel sympathy with Palestinians and another 10% with Israel. Back to you, Peter.
All right, Benny, before we went to the break, we were talking about how the international community looks at the right of return. Do you want to summarize real quickly what you had to say before we went to the break?
Yeah. The return of 5 million Palestinian refugees, and that's the number the Palestinians cite, to the area of the State of Israel would demolish the State of Israel and would turn it instantly into an Arab state from a Jewish state. There would be no Jewish state. So almost every Israeli I know opposes what the Palestinians are demanding, which is the return of the Palestinian refugees. And the West, America, Western Europe, etc., do not support the right of return, as the Palestinians call it, of the refugees. Unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership, both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, insist that Israel must accept this right of return. And this is simply not going to happen, and this is a major obstacle on the road to a possible solution.
Okay, Norman, I get that's a political solution there, but is that morally fair? Is that fair to the Palestinians? I mean, the Israelis have a right of return.
Well, I would like to make 2 points, or I should say quickly 3 points. Number one, we have a rich documentary record on this question. It's not a matter of speculation. Mr. Morris, or Dr. Morris, seems to think that the only people who support the right of return are what he calls a few banana republics. But every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine question. Every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine question. And one of the terms of the settlement is a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return. And the vote this past year was 164-7. The whole world on one side, including all the European countries, the whole world on one side, the United States, Israel, Australia, Nauru, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands on the other side. If you look at the major human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, both of them produced position papers in 2000 and 2001 in which they endorsed the right of return of the Palestinian refugees in what they called success.